Tonight, in Democracy 20, 20 years of labor relations in one of the most unionized countries in the world.
What has happened is that certain things which we used to fight for has been achieved. Now we need to change gears to fight against unemployment, inequality and poverty.
Looking at the role music played in South Africa's fight for democracy.
I think musicians generally have played the role of being the mirror, of being a mirror for society.
And on this day, 15 years ago, a new mother of the nation was introduced to South Africa and the world. Well, hello and a very warm welcome to Democracy 20, your pre-election program that traces the progress of our country over the past 20 years of democracy. Let's start tonight by looking at 20 years of labor relations in the country. South Africa is now the most unionized country in the world. In fact, one of the most unionized countries in the world. It all started gradually in the 80s, but things soon picked up. That was way after 1994.
In 1994, the new democratic government inherited a fragmented country. One of its key challenges was to build many national institutions from scratch. It also had to pass new laws to give effect to the Bill of Rights. This included new labor laws giving workers protection which they did not enjoy under apartheid. Firstly, the Labor Relations Act. A bigger improvement has been made to an extent that we have certain rights, such as May 1, which was not there, which we fought very, very hard for, and many other additional holidays. The basic condition of employment, which limited hours of work. I used to work underground. There was no limit until you finish your job. The fact that those pieces of legislation made it possible to protect workers to a certain extent.
When we've had the first batch of laws introduced to govern the labor relations environment, the new labor relations environment under a democratic government, it took us a while to bed those down. Once those pieces of legislation were bedded, particularly the Labor Relations Act was key amongst those, then we spent a few years operating under those pieces of legislation and becoming accustomed to the framework that those pieces of legislation provided.
20 years on, and the government has introduced amendments to the labor laws and other labor market reforms in a bid to promote employment and reduce the country's stubbornly high unemployment rate. The move has unleashed a storm of controversy. It has also further fueled divisions in the country's giant labor federation, COSATU.
Those are rights that workers in this country have been enjoying since 1994, since there was legislation that guaranteed those rights. But today, as we're speaking, all those rights that we talk about are under attack. They are being eroded one by one. The worst example of that is now the employment tax incentive scheme, which has now been introduced not so long ago, this year from January. There is a law, and that law is nothing else, it's an attack on the rights and gains that were made by workers in the past, because that law is about ensuring that the labor in the labor market in South Africa, a low wage regime is being driven within the labor market.
Whenever you impose development creates more needs. What has happened is that certain things which we used to fight for has been achieved. Now we need to change gears to fight against unemployment, inequality and poverty.
Employers are also opposed to the proposed amendments to the labor laws.
From a business perspective, our key concern is that there's increasing regulation which makes it a more rigid labor market and very difficult for business to operate in relation to labor.
In the midst of this, the country has seen an escalation in strikes and labor unrest.
Now we find ourselves in a circumstance where it's no longer a limited period of strike activity in a given year, but we're finding that we're moving from year to year with ongoing strike activity, and the mining sector being key in terms of adverse impact as far as that goes.
And COSATU, which was once an unrivaled dominant labor federation in the country, is on the verge of splitting up.
Today, it is quite clear in the minds of everybody that within the alliance, COSATU or the working class has been the biggest loser from the past 20 years. The past 20 years has belonged to the bosses at the expense of the poor and the most marginalized. And that's where COSATU unions are exposed today. We're being exposed for no any other reason, because we have allowed ourselves to be in a cozy relationship, even when the relationship was at the expense of our own constituents. At the moment, the battle in COSATU, that battle is about those who still want COSATU to be a sweetheart union or sweetheart federation to the ANC government today. And between those who are saying, no, we can't allow to have a federation of workers. When workers are busy swimming in poverty, in all manner of exploitation, we continue to be in a cozy relationship in an alliance.
COSATU is not a political party. COSATU is a labor federation. Being in alliance with the ANC, the intention is to ensure that political agenda is realized through the ANC and the SACP in realizing socialism insofar as the SACP is concerned. Whereas COSATU continue to champion labor-related matters. You cannot divorce politics from labor issues. But if NUMSA wants to be a political party, and therefore think that if you divorce yourself from the alliance, at the same time becoming a political party, that's oxymoron tendency.
Next week, COSATU's Central Executive Committee will meet to decide NUMSA's fate. NUMSA insiders say the union, which is currently COSATU's majority affiliate with some 350,000 members, will be expelled. If that happens, other COSATU unions, which are sympathetic to NUMSA, and the Federation's suspended General Secretary, Zoenzi Mavavi, will most likely leave the Federation in solidarity. That will usher in a new era in the country's changing labor landscape. Mbongeni Mutwa, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Now, as usual, we've been asking you at home to take part in our special pre-election program by emailing us your views this to elections@sabc.co.za, or you can send SMSs to us. This at 33726, and remember to begin your SMS with the word vote, and every SMS will cost you R150. For tweets, use the hashtag SABC Elections, and you can also find us on our Facebook page, that is SABC News Online. Send us your comments. We will try and put them through to our guests as we go on. Well, going back to the labour issue and our guests, we're now joined by Cas Kovadia, who is the caretaker CEO at Business Unity South Africa, also known as BUSA. Mr. Kovadia is also MD of the South African Banking Association. Good evening, Mr. Kovadia. How are you doing tonight?
Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm doing well, thanks for having me.
Coming off that package we've just listened to from Mbongeni Mutwa, is South African labour, has been so regulated, it is now at a standstill, a quagmire, where we have problems?
Well, I think we do have significant labour regulation in South Africa. And I think that the labour regulation has often been cited as one factor that's inhibiting investment into the country. Having said that, one certainly does not want to say that we should have a regulatory regime that does not protect workers, and I think the right to strike, strong labor unions are an essential element of, I think, a strong democracy and a robust democracy. But I think that we should also consider the fact that we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. The priority for the country, not just for labor unions, not just for business, the priority for the country, one of the biggest national interest issues, has got to be job creation.
Yeah.
And we've got to ask ourselves whether labor regulation is actually inhibiting job creation or promoting job creation. And those are the sorts of discussions we need to have.
I think then the question comes in, I think you touched on it right there when you speak about the role of labor unions themselves. Are we finding a situation where our unions are too politically inclined, so to speak, or leaning, so to speak, that they forget what their jobs really are, which is protect the labor market?
Well, I think let's understand that we have a particular history. I think during the anti-apartheid struggle, the labor movement under COSATU and some of its predecessors played a tremendous role in mobilizing against apartheid. And I think that under apartheid, labor unions, civic organizations, all of us needed to play a role to actually move us towards democracy and to destroy apartheid. So I think there was a role for all of us to play, take a political stance in those days. I think today we need to ask ourselves. We need to ask ourselves whether the alliance as we knew it pre-democracy should still be functioning as it has been functioning. We need to ask ourselves whether some labor unions being close to particular political parties impinges upon their objectivity and impinges upon their ability to represent worker issues. And these are all questions I think that we as a country need to begin to ask ourselves. I think some of the issues that have come up in the labor movement recently have been, in the views of some, informed by the fact that some unions have moved away from what are the worker issues and have concentrated too much on politics. So, we need to ask those questions.
Now, we see more and more strikes, obviously, some of them quite violent and very costly to the economy as far as the country is concerned. Now, this is not helping at all as far as which leads to overseas investors, which you touched earlier on, not wanting to come to South Africa because they're not quite sure whether their businesses are safe. How do we get around, try and quell these things and get onto the business of business, which is creating jobs?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, strikes are an essential element of a democracy, okay? So you have strikes all over the world. It's not only in South Africa. I think here what's beginning to happen is, I think, what used to be a fairly cohesive labor movement is beginning to fracture, and we can go into all sorts of reasons why that's happening. I think that strikes, the nature of the strikes are becoming worrying. So in certain instances, the violent nature of the strikes and the infringement of the rights of people to work, people who may not want to strike. I think the length of the strikes are becoming an issue. And I think that certain unions are sort of squaring off against each other to try and get support, and therefore there seems to be a vicious cycle downwards. So the demands are becoming far more stringent. And again, one needs to look at that within the context of a globalized economy, within the context of an environment where investors will look at where they have good returns and conducive business environment.
Before we run out of time, Kaz, we were sitting in South Africa 20 years since 1994. The labor in itself, is it healthy? Is it viable? Besides the problems that we're hearing. 10 seconds, please.
Is labor viable?
Is it healthy?
Well, I think that there are problems. I think that firstly, the labor regulations, I think we need to look at. I think to have a fractured labor movement is not necessarily healthy for the country. And I think that labor, just like all other constituencies, need to look at what labor's role should be in a democracy, as business has had to do and others have had to do.
Mr. Kaz Kovadia, thank you very much for joining us right here on Democracy 20. Mr. Kovadia is Caretaker CEO at Business Unity South Africa. Thank you very much for sharing your views with us here. We'll take a short break. Don't go away. When you come back, we take a look at some of your tweets and some of your interesting thoughts on the program. Stay tuned. Democracy 20 continues.
Zoom into Africa. This is Namibia. The president is Mr. Hifikepunye Pohamba. Namibia got independent from South Africa on 21 March 1990. The population is over 2 million people. One of the major languages spoken is English. Monetary unit is the Namibian dollar. Coming up this week,
we talk about Nigeria's social network, UCOS. And discuss the school's connectivity program in depth. All this and more technology and social media news.
Join Siphumelele Zondi on Network every Sunday at 19:30 CAT.
Welcome back. You're still watching Democracy 20, and today we are examining how Labour has fared over the past 20 years of democracy. And with me in studio now is Kimani Ndungu, Executive Director of the National Labour and Economic Development Institute, or NALEDI, which is a research arm of COSATU. Mr. Ndungu, thank you very much for joining us right here on Democracy 20. Let's start back immediately. Looking back to 1994, have the workplace changed in terms of production structure, equity and skills development?
There have been a lot of changes, and thanks for having me on the show. There have been very many changes, not just in the workplace, but in the general labor market in our country. I think the most fundamental changes have been changes in the way that work is done, the way the production systems are designed. We have seen a lot of mechanization, we have seen a lot of capitalization, and consequently we've seen a lot of job losses. In terms of the laws that exist, for example, for workers, we've also seen certain fundamental changes, that workers are better protected than they were before 1994. And certainly that includes the question of employment equity, where discrimination in its unlawful form has been outlawed. So there have been major changes, yes, and I think there's cause for celebration for that.
You speak about joblessness. A large number of people in South Africa are quite, are jobless, and minimum wages are enforced. Are you not worried that maybe the labour legislation favours the very few?
That's not the case, and I think that has been a sort of bogey that has been thrown around in order to deflect the genuine and legitimate calls for the better protection of workers. If you look at the kind of rights that workers enjoy in our country today, it's essentially the right against unfair dismissal, for example, which goes to the heart of what one is as a worker, the right to employment security. If you look at the question of unfair discrimination, that we had practices in the past running for over 100 years, if not 150 years, where the majority of workers, who were essentially black workers, did not enjoy any form of recognition initially as workers. So when we hear calls about minimum wages, we have to look at the kind of wages that workers in our labour market earn. We're looking at about 3,000 to 2,500 rand being earned by over 50% of workers in our labour market. Certainly 2,500 is not a lot of money that anybody could speak about. Hence the need to have some sort of national legislated minimum for workers.
I mean, an example of that would be the strikes, the Marikana issue, with people wanting higher wages, so to speak, as compared to the minimum wage.
I think that's a bit different. Now, if you look at Marikana as a case study, just look at the kind of wages that workers were earning. They're 2,500 for incredibly difficult and dangerous work. But you have to contrast that with the kind of income and the kind of packages that executives earn. So sometimes when you hear calls and talks about we cannot afford these, employers cannot afford these, the reality is that there's a very skewed distribution of income in our country. And there's statistics and there's research that shows that over the last 15 to 20 years, the share of income, national income that goes to profits has increased, while the share of income that goes to wages has decreased. So there's a legitimate call to say, let's have a better distribution of income in our economy.
Now, labour-intensive projects are increasingly being discarded in favour of, mechanization, so to speak, especially in agriculture. What do you suggest can be done in order to stop these types of joblessness? Well,
there's a number of things, and I think we can see some of them when we look at the kind of economic and industrial policies that have been suggested by government. If you think about our industrial policy action plan, or the new growth path, or the national development plan, there's a call for us as a country to begin looking into different sectors, mainly the productive sectors. We're talking about agriculture, for instance. Forestation is one another area where we could do a lot. It requires a lot of human capacity, not necessarily mechanization. We're also talking about, say, the mining sector, where traditionally we've seen a lot of machines being brought in. And we've been arguing as Labour and saying, why don't we beneficiate our minerals, for instance? Why just dig up the minerals and send them abroad, to all sorts of countries and buy back the finished product? We could create a lot of jobs by merely looking at the way we do things and changing the model which currently informs our economic structure.
Let's get back to COSATU now being one of the unions. There's quite a lot of tension within the COSATU itself. What do we foresee looking at May 7 after the elections? Will it stay together?
Well, the question of whether COSATU stays together is one that I think the members are discussing right now and the leadership of COSATU. So we as NALEDI, being a research organization, we have not been privy to that kind of discussion. But I think it would be sad if COSATU, as a labor federation and given its role in our economy, would not hold together. And I think in the interest of workers, it's better that there is a united COSATU.
Mr. Ndungu, thank you very much for joining us right in Democracy 20. Mr. Kimani Ndungu is Executive Director of NALEDI, the research arm of COSATU.
Thank you.
And now for something completely different, music, especially jazz, played a much more important role rather than mere entertainment during South Africa's fight for democracy. In fact, it had helped support and shape the anti-apartheid movement. In celebrating 20 years of freedom, Americans have paid tribute to the special role of jazz. Howard University in Washington invited young South African musicians to take part in a special workshop.
Yes,
Sibongile Khumalo was just 8 when she started singing jazz. The legendary musician who grew up in Soweto says there's always a message behind the music. In those days, it was the struggle against apartheid, and now she says music, like the country, is finding its new identity.
We are still going through some kind of transition when it comes to what is our vision, what is our message, and that's a general reflection of the country as a whole. What is our vision as a country, South Africa? What do we want? How do we see ourselves? How do we want to project ourselves? And I think musicians generally play the role of being the mirror, of being a mirror for society, of being a reflector of what's happening in society. So there's going to have to be a way for us musicians, jazz musicians in particular, to regroup and say, okay, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we saying? What are we reflecting as in the art form that we perform?
The students were in for quite a treat.
When I heard that they were going to be bringing musicians from South Africa, I decided that I should come and check it out. And I always have my horns, so I didn't know that they were going to have me play or anything. So I didn't know the song. It was crazy.
Jason Badenhorst was just 10 when South Africa held its first democratic elections. He says while the future is exciting, it's important to learn from the past.
The young artists that are doing really well are the ones that embrace the past and use it and utilize it to have a voice now. Not pushing it aside, not erasing it, not changing names, not doing anything, saying that is part of my history and that is why I am what I am now. The beautiful thing about South Africa for me is that there's so much space for change and there's so much space for opportunity.
And there's little doubt about the opportunity that this workshop brought to the young musicians who were there, an opportunity to sing, dance and learn.
I definitely learned that jazz music did the same thing for the South Africans that it did for Black Americans. Like it kind of liberated them and gave them a voice and gave them a platform with which to speak about the ills that they were going through.
In 1994, Nelson Mandela came here to Howard University to receive an honorary doctorate. In his speech to thousands, he asked for their help with his country's transition to democracy. And now, 20 years later, a group of South African musicians are here again to celebrate his legacy. Kate Fisher, SABC News, Washington.
Nice package indeed. We'll be back shortly after this break. Democracy 20 continues. Stay with us.
SABC News plays a critical role in providing unbiased and reliable news. We have a well-established reputation of uncovering, reporting and delivering news. A significant growth in popularity of our news demonstrates the demand for our news content. We continue to provide unrivaled coverage of vital events in and out of the country. Wherever the news is happening, we'll be there to bring them to you at the right time. No one has the news covered like SABC News. We lead and they follow. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Zoom into Africa. This is Ethiopia. The Prime Minister is Mr. Haile Mariam Desalegn. Ethiopia is Africa's oldest independent country. It was never colonized. The population is more than 80 million people. One of the major languages spoken is English. Monetary unit, birr.
Welcome back to the final section of Democracy 20. Now, on this day 15 years ago, former President Nelson Mandela formally introduced his wife Graça to members of his clan. Graça Machel, widow of the late Mozambican President Samora Machel, then acquired a new name, Nosizwe, which means mother of the nation. This is how SABC News reported on the matter on the 3rd of April in 1999.
At about 11 this morning, President Mandela, accompanied by presiding bishop of the Methodist Church, Reverend Mvumi Dandlala, emerged from the main house to greet his in-laws. He then proceeded to consult with elders of the Tembu Royal House about the formal introduction of his wife. Around noon, President Mandela and his wife proceeded hand in hand to the public ceremony. Here, the Mthatha choral choir, amid adulation, was already singing about Graça's new name, Nosizwe. King Buyelekayo Dalindyebo announced during the ceremony that President Mandela will become the overall chief in the Mthatha jurisdiction following his retirement in June.
Now, before we go, let's take a quick look at some of the tweets you've sent in throughout the show. We start off, well, in fact, this is a Facebook message. This one comes from Zalegi Siko Hole. He says, Hole rather, apologies for that. Rights cannot exist without responsibilities. Let's move over to another one. This one, also a Facebook message from Tungu Sintu. Yes, they should strike because there's a huge difference between the rich and the poor. Sintu Tungu from Cape Town. And one more from Opinionated African. This is a tweet, and this one says, the mini wage is not a living wage. SABC Elections, that's how you can get hold of us. The companies can afford to give a little bit more. People are working but are poor. And unfortunately, that's what we come to the end with. And on that note, rather, we come to the end of the show. Join us again on Monday evening at 6:30 right here on SABC3 and, of course, SABC News Channel 404. The English news continues immediately after this. Stay tuned.